Hey everybody, this is Skipper Davies, Project Manager in Tech with a focus in cybersecurity and cloud technologies. And today we're going to talk just a little bit, short video on firewalls. Kind of got to that part in the TryHackMe pre-security lane of training. I know about firewalls, I think most people do, but I figured we'd talk a little bit about them, what they are, a few different types, not exhaustive list, and some considerations from the defensive and offensive security sides. So without further ado, we'll jump right into it. So you can see right here, essentially you got your external users, the firewall, whatever firewall it is, and then everything else on the other side of it. So essentially what's happening here is any kind of external traffic or users that want to come in and access your network, they essentially need to have certain rules met in order to access the network. Or in some cases, it can be so strict that it's blocking any kind of external user or external traffic from accessing your network and what's attached to that network. So that would be the firewall in general. There are two types of firewalls that are there, and you can think of firewalls essentially as a list of rules for what someone has to meet in order to access or interact with devices or other things on your network. So there's stateless and stateful firewalls. So stateless would be kind of like a dumber firewall that basically has static rules that are in place. You either meet the rule or you don't. And then if you meet the rule, you have access and you can do things, or if you don't meet the rule, then you're just blocked. Essentially, stateful is more complicated. So essentially, it's looking at the whole context of a connection. It's looking at things in real time, and it's doing a lot more consideration. It's possible, like if you're doing a TCP connection where you have the whole three-way handshake that we talked about last time, SYN, ACK, that sort of thing. It's possible to have some of that connection start to happen with a stateful firewall, even though it's going to deny the connection later. So you're able to partially begin that three-way handshake, but then it ends up dropping the connection later. And it doesn't always block the device entirely, whereas a stateless firewall can block a device permanently if it doesn't meet certain rules. So that's always a possibility. So other things you can see here as well, like the stateful firewalls are slower compared to the stateless one. They also are more expensive, but they are more secure, or they're seen as more secure. And they also tend to use more computational resources, which also gets to the slowness part of things. This one, stateless, it's convenient, it's easier to set up, it's maybe less secure, but you can make as many rules as you want and kind of have it be static and just say, hey, you can't come in. So like it says here, predefined packet filtering rules. And if those packets conform to the rules, then it's allowed to pass through. And if they're not, if the conditions aren't met, then it's considered unidentified or malicious, so it'll be blocked, that sort of thing. So that's just the quick rundown there. And this one, of course, is faster than the stateful firewall. So that's a rundown in terms of the two general different types of firewalls. But there's a few other things. You might be thinking, well, how do hackers deal with firewalls in general? Well, they never attack the firewall directly, at least that I've seen. Maybe that has happened in rare cases, but that's a surefire way. That'd be like sending a whole infantry brigade to do a frontal assault of a fortified position versus sending a spy in to sabotage it, or sending in like special forces to sneak in at night. Those are different ways of dealing with it. You're not probably going to attack a firewall directly, but you can do that a little bit. If the thing about stateful firewalls is they are vulnerable to DDoS attacks, denial of service attacks, where you just try to flood it, and then it overwhelms it. I think that's probably possible, I guess. But there's a few things here. This is from good old Gemini, doing a little bit of a summary, but how they kind of deal with it is a variety of ways. Either social engineering, where they're trying to do a phishing email or something like that to trick people into handing over their information or logging credentials, or click on and run some sort of malicious code to bypass it, or a misconfiguration in the firewall itself, which we'll talk about a little bit in a second, or application layer attacks, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, because it's avoiding the firewall entirely. The firewalls don't monitor that kind of traffic. So if you have an issue in an application that's vulnerable, that can be a way in that goes around that firewall. And then tunnels and VPNs, there's a few things around that as well that get into DNS or HTTP. Notice there's no HTTPS here. That's just a pure HTTP connection. That's why you sometimes get warnings in your browser if you're going to an HTTP site as opposed to S, because it's more vulnerable in that sense. So the thing about the social engineering aspect of things is, generally speaking, if you, let's say that you have a firewall set up and it's set up to where it's blocking all outbound traffic coming in, but it's allowing you to connect out to something else. Well, once you connect to something else that's outside of your network, then, and that connection is established, it can stay established because it's trusted. It's not violating any firewall rule in most cases. If you have it set up that way, that's a very common way to set it up. So the idea behind the social engineering aspect is someone sends you an email. It's like, hey, I've got some free football tickets for you. You're like, ooh, I love football. You click on the thing, and then what it's doing is it's then establishing that connection from inside, because you said you basically clicked on something that allowed it to happen without you knowing it. And then once that connection has been established to that outside device that's outside of your network, well, guess what? You're screwed because you're now connected, and they're able to basically cover up their tracks and then try to move laterally, try to move up and down, try to move in and look at resources and do other things. And then they essentially have access to all your stuff. So that's the idea behind social engineering, and that's how you get around that firewall. Is because if your rules are set up to allow you to connect out to something, which is usually the case, then it's basically exploiting the fact that is generally the case. But there's other things here as well, misconfigurations. So the misconfiguration one is really interesting because this is essentially exploiting humans' propensity to create errors or to just do overly permissive rules or leave certain ports open. And if we look at a couple of statistics here, so Gartner research essentially says over 95% of the breaches that happen are happening because firewalls were set up incorrectly rather than failing technologically. So a technological failure would include some sort of flaw in the way the firewall was designed, or would include the fact that it hasn't been patched and stuff like that. And that gets to this other part here. So sometimes people don't patch software as often as they should be. Actually, that happens a lot. They might not be patching their firewall as well and getting it to be the latest updated thing. So that's a issue there as well, where people are running outdated vulnerable firewall or firmware because things lag behind weaponization, like it says here. But there's some nuance to this, because recently there was a hack with, I think it was Fedora Rawhide, where it was what was called a supply side attack. And a supply side attack is essentially you're looking for the engineers that are working on the software. It could be open source software or whatever. And you're essentially trying to hack their accounts and inject vulnerabilities and then push that out with an update. And then if everybody's patching their software and staying up to date like they should be, guess what? They just all downloaded, like millions of people just downloaded a vulnerable version of Rawhide, which can be exploited. NPM has had a whole bunch of supply side attacks, supply chain attacks recently as well. And you can Google that and find that out. So it's been a big issue, and that seems to be increasingly the target is the supply side, because then you get millions of people to download the update, which has vulnerabilities in it or malicious code in it. So, and that's only been accelerating because of the use of artificial intelligence. So you do want to patch your software, you want to patch your firewalls, etc., your routers, etc. But you also have to keep in mind that there are these supply side attacks. One way you could do it is to patch everything, but slightly, patch it like maybe slightly later than when the patches come out. That's not a great idea either. So there's not really a perfect solution to this, I don't think, but just things to consider. And then with this misconfigurations thing, you might be thinking, okay, well, 95% of the breaches that have occurred because firewalls were set up incorrectly. So what does that look like? What does it mean by incorrectly? And then how many firewalls in general are set up or misconfigured, set up incorrectly? Well, there's an answer to those questions. So essentially, it's not that 99% of firewalls are misconfigured. That's not the case. It's just that the majority are misconfigured. So 60% basically of enterprise firewalls, that would be large organizations, companies, etc., have some sort of high severity misconfiguration or compliance failure. So that's over half. Over half are misconfigured in a major way that you can exploit. So if you just throw spaghetti at the wall and say, just try to find one that's misconfigured, you're going to find something, because most of them are misconfigured. And then it says that most firewalls are not misconfigured, but that's actually not true, because actually the majority of them are misconfigured in some way. So it contradicted itself. But this is actually the accurate piece, because I've looked at this in other places. So most of them are misconfigured. And there's a couple, you might be like, well, okay, so most of them are misconfigured. That answers that question. But what about the question of, what does a misconfiguration look like? Well, there's a couple ways that this can happen. So one is that the user, when they set up the firewall, let's say it's the stateless firewall where it's static rules. They might set up a whole bunch of rules that don't make sense, or that are too loose, or they set up duplicative rules. Even if it's a stateful firewall, there are going to be rules in there. And in an organization, you might have multiple people who have access to that, which would not necessarily be great. They might have different perspectives on security. They might set up different rules. Some of those rules might be duplicative. Some of those rules might not have a clear owner. Someone might leave an organization, and then the rules that they set up or they were in charge of, they're just kind of hanging out there with no owner. And they might be outdated or causing some sort of issue. So there's a lot of misconfigurations that can happen that way. It might be that someone, and this happens with the average user at home, not at the enterprise level, but it might be that the average user at home decides, hey, I have to loosen my firewall rules a little bit in order to get this thing to work, whatever that thing is. It could be like a game connection type thing. It could be downloading some sort of software that they need, which is legitimate software. It might not have a vulnerability or anything, might not be malicious. But they basically loosen up the rules, do whatever action they need to be doing, and then they don't go back and change the rules back to be more stringent than they were. So some of this can be oversight, some of it can be laziness. And essentially, it comes down to the human factor as the core problem, core vulnerability there. And that's the thing that you should really take away from this, is that humans are the single point of failure. That gets back to the whole social engineering side of things right here. This right here is so heavily used, and it's even easier to do with artificial intelligence. In the past, and some of you who are watching this may remember this, the whole Nigerian prince scam, where it's like, oh, I'm a Nigerian prince, and I, have to leave the country, but only you can help me get my gold bars out of the country. So give me your bank account, and I'll do a deposit there, and then I'll give you 10% of that. And there's this whole thing, convoluted nonsense, and gift cards, and you got to give me the gift card and all this other stuff. So the thing about that is, like, it has gotten way more sophisticated than that now. And usually that stuff was like in some broken English or something. Well, now you can use artificial intelligence, which you're seeing here actually in my window. You can use that to create a whole fake driver's license that can pass a driver's license scanning type of thing. You can even create a fake video of a fake person on the fake driver's license, and the fake video of them holding up the driver's license for verification, turning their head and everything like that. They can do all that. They can do really good English now and put that in an email, and it's like almost flawless. They even know the little things, like they know to leave out the EM dashes that are frequently generated in posts and letters and things like that. So they can kind of get it down like that. So it's down to like a science almost. And it's getting increasingly difficult and sophisticated for people to know what's real and what isn't. And it's a big problem. And of course, they're able to create all kinds of code very quickly that's malicious, and then just put it and attach it to things, and then do things with that and put it up to the user. You don't even necessarily need to know how to write malicious code in order to exploit things. And for people who might be a little bit older, maybe there's a little bit of senility going on or just a lack of familiarity with technology, those folks are particularly vulnerable. And the social engineering stuff can include things like cloning someone's voice and then calling from a number that looks legitimate, can even be spoofing the person's actual number. And calling a parent and saying, hey, I got in a car accident and I need money and blah, 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 blah. I really need your help right now. And it's playing on the emotions of that person. And it sounds indistinguishable from the actual person because they clone their voice. In those cases, it can be hard for the person, but the only way you can really basically avoid being exploited by something like that is to tell the person, and this is hard to do in the moment, but tell the person, all right, I believe you, but I just need to hang up and call you back. And then that person should hang up, dial the person's number, manually would be the ideal, not call back the same number that called, even if it looks the same. Call them back and say, hey, I just got this call from you. I just want to check, is everything okay? What's going on? And in some cases, when people have done that, the person's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I never called you. And it's really crazy. So these are all some of the ways that people get around the whole firewall issue. So firewalls may look like this guard standing there that's stopping everybody from accessing the network and network resources. But the reality is that there's a variety of ways to get around that, and people do all the time. So just a little bit about firewalls and some considerations from the defensive, offensive side, what they are, things like that. A little bit of a rundown without getting too technical. And I'll include some of these links to at least these two resources there as well. And Try Hack Me has a really great section on firewalls. So if you want to learn more, this is a great resource to go into, and it's very cheap for what you're getting knowledge-wise. There's a little bit of exercises around it as well, so I'd recommend that. And that's it, and talk to you soon. Bye.